The Japanese attacks in the Pacific in December 1941 shook the world. This was going to be a far different war than experienced in Europe. The vast distances of the Pacific would make tremendous demands on the Allies' military resources. Through 1942, the Americans, along with smaller British and Australian forces, were desperate just to stop the Japanese, and defensive maneuvers were not well suited for airborne forces. There would be precious few resources placed in the hands of General Douglas MacArthur, who had been named Supreme Allied Commander in the Pacific. His primary weapons were the U.S. Navy and Marines. Paratroopers, for the most part, would be assigned to the European theater. The 1st Marine Parachute Battalion was the first airborne unit to face battle, although they would be used in amphibious operations. The Marines were part of the attack on Guadalcanal in early August 1943. The first airborne parachute drop in the Pacific War took place on September 5, 1943. The 503rd Parachute Regiment was transported by C-47 from Port Moresby, New Guinea, to the airfield at Nadzab near the coast, where they dropped unopposed. The plan was for the Paras to hold the airfield so that Australian infantry could be flown in. The airfield, in fact, had been abandoned by the Japanese. In the entire operation, there had only been one brief contact with the Japanese. There would be no further action for the regiment until June of 1944. A Japanese base on the island of Newfoundland, to the west of New Guinea, remained intact and had been supplying Japanese outposts. General MacArthur decided to remove this irritation. An amphibious operation only had been planned, but it was decided at the last minute, due to fears of Japanese reinforcement of the island, to add an airborne operation. The 503rd once again was set into action. 2 battalions were airlifted and dropped on the island. It was not the Japanese who were the enemy on this drop. It would be faulty altimeters in the aircraft. They would be dropping the men from too low an altitude, not giving the parachutes enough time to fully open. The first wave suffered some 10% casualties due to severe drop injuries. The next day, another battalion suffered large losses. The 3rd Battalion of the regiment would be brought ashore by boat. The regiment went to fight as infantry until the end of August 1944. In 1943, the 11th Airborne Division had been shaping up and was ready for action. Its official existence began in late February 1943. It was first committed to action on Leyte in the Philippines in November 1944, although only in the line infantry role on the ground. The 11th continued fighting a jungle war in Leyte until moving on to its next target in late January 1944, Luzon, the northernmost of the principal islands of the Philippine Group. The division's first mission here was the capture of Tagaytay Ridge, a prominent tactical feature overlooking the main road to the capital, Manila. The terrain was unsuitable to gliders, so it was decided that 2 glider battalions would go in by sea and then be reinforced by air. The fighting was very intense. The 11th marched on Manila, which was very heavily defended, and did not fall until February 21st. This was street-to-street combat, a very different style of fighting from what the Americans had been used to while island hopping across the Pacific. The Japanese were determined to make the Americans pay dearly for every foot of ground they took. Finally, the sheer force of willpower and arms won the day for the Americans, and the fighting around and in Manila gradually subsided. In the fighting for the capital, the 11th Airborne lost 900 of its 8,000 men, but Japanese losses exceeded 3,000. Even while the battle for Manila was still raging, the 11th's next mission was being planned in great secrecy.
There was a prison camp that was south of Manila, about 30 or 40 miles, that was 20 miles or 30 miles behind enemy lines. And the rumor was that the prisoners, about 2,100 of them, were to be killed. MacArthur found out about it, and General MacArthur asked the commander of the 11th Airborne Division to assign a task force to liberate the prisoners in Los Baños.
A Pathfinder platoon was secretly sent in at night to be in position for the main assault. That came with a company of paratroopers in 9 Dakotas, dropping on the prison. Within 20 minutes, there were 243 Japanese dead, and not a single fatality amongst either the prisoners or their rescuers. The 11th Airborne was given the nickname Angels for the Los Baños rescue. Throughout the spring and summer of 1944, fighting continued on Luzon Island. There would be one last great combat jump in the Pacific War. The target was Corregidor Island, the headquarters of the American Army before its humiliating surrender to the Japanese in 1942. Corregidor was at the entrance to Manila Bay, which was not only heavily fortified and garrisoned by nearly 5,000 tough Imperial Japanese Marines, but also had several powerful batteries of coastal guns which constantly fired at passing ships. However, Allied intelligence grossly underestimated the strength of the enemy garrison, and a mere 4 battalions of troops were selected, these to take on an enemy with a strength of greater than half a division. February 16th was D-Day. The Paras had a very small drop zone. It was the parade ground of the former U.S. Army topside barracks and a golf course. That meant that each aircraft could not drop a complete stick, but would have to deposit half a dozen men and return for a second pass. The assault was preceded by an aerial and naval bombardment, which did little damage to the well-dug-in Japanese positions, and the Paras suffered many casualties from landing on shattered rocks, trees, and blocks of concrete, which, due to the high prevailing wind, they were helpless to avoid. The wind also pulled a number of Paras over the cliffs to their deaths on the rocks beneath before they could deflate their parachutes or release their harnesses. There were numerous casualties. The airborne medics did what they could to ease the suffering of the injured with their limited amount of medical supplies. Nevertheless, within a few hours, the Paras had completely succeeded in capturing topside and killing the Japanese commander. The battle for Corregidor would last until February 27th. Many Japanese died beneath the rubble, sealed off from escape in the underground tunnels of the island. On March 2nd, General Douglas MacArthur returned to Corregidor and was saluted by the Paras, who were so instrumental in liberating the island. The 11th Airborne would be one of the first units to set foot on Japanese soil upon the enemy's surrender. British pairs only undertook one major operation, other than as ground forces, in the Far East. This was in Burma and undertaken by the famous Chindits. Their official title was the 77th Independent Brigade. The unofficial but more popular title came from the name of the mythical beast which guards the Burmese temple, the Chint. They would face great hardships in the jungle fighting. The brigade had been brought into existence late in 1942 by the unorthodox and deeply religious Ord Wingate to penetrate in small columns deep into the Burmese jungle, attacking Japanese supply convoys and blowing up railway lines and bridges. In their first operation, from February to April 1943, the Chindits blew up railway lines in 75 places and, more importantly, proved that the war could be taken to the enemy on equal terms. Their second major operation was in February the following year. This time, the Chindits were 6 brigades strong, but only 3 were used in the first phase, the 16th, 77th, and 111th. They would form the point of Lieutenant General William Slim's 14th Army, which was to strike into Burma from Assam, and link up with General Joseph Vinegar Joe Stilwell, heading the joint U.S.-Chinese Army pressing down from the north. The 16th marched overland. The other 2 brigades were flown in Waco Hague gliders to land in 3 jungle clearings astride the main railway line, codenamed White City. The Americans provided many of the transports and gliders for the operation. The terrain was not very conducive for large-scale airborne operations. The Waco was the only glider used in Burma. In Europe, the Dakota tow planes might handle 2 Wacos. In Burma, however, the high mountains surrounding the base airfield made for dangerous going. The tugs and gliders could sometimes barely have enough clearance to get airborne. The high hills of Burma also made for limited places for the gliders to land. Those areas that were clear enough for landing were often water-sodden fields that made for dangerous landings. The men would be reliant on air resupply. The Southeast Asian theater of war had not been a priority for either men or equipment. Still, the airborne forces managed with what they had been assigned. The gliders, which could carry only a handful of men, made sortie after sortie to bring men and supplies into the jungle clearing. The Chindits' mission was to harass the Japanese along their supply route for transporting supplies to their army fighting in China. Although Wingate was killed in an air crash in March 1944, his Chindits succeeded in tying down and crippling 3 Japanese divisions for months. The exhausted survivors finally linked up with Stilwell's forces in June. The Chindits were now known as the Forgotten Army, but carried on with their mission in spite of many losses to Japanese guns and disease. The end of the Second World War saw a rapid demobilization of airborne forces in most of the world. The most significant exception would be the Soviet Union. The British 1st Airborne was disbanded entirely. Elements of the 6th Airborne, however, saw service in Palestine. Hostilities between Arabs and Jews increased in the immediate post-war years. It was a difficult peace to keep, and Britain's responsibility for Palestine ended in 1948.
Most of the towns were out of bounds to us. We weren't allowed in them. We were in barbed wire camps, and we weren't allowed out the camps. It was like being in prison. You didn't have any leisure out there at all. There were two or three other lads got caught in some Jewish quarter, and we woke up, looked out of our tents one morning, and there were these 3. They'd strung them up on trees at the entrance of our camp. they'd hung them, and that was the sort of thing that was happening. So, yeah, it was a bad time, Palestine.
Soon the Peres were reduced to 1 brigade of men. The advent of the atomic bomb appeared to make the use of massive armies obsolete, but that attitude changed in August 1950. Communist North Korean troops invaded the southern part of the country. The Korean War was on. The aggression had caught the Western allies by surprise. Under a United Nations mandate, Americans, British, and Australians rushed to defend the South. Ultimately, 13 nations would send contingents. The Americans represented by far the largest number of men. The only parachute unit to see action during the war, which would last until July of 1953, was the 187th Regimental Combat Team from the 11th Airborne Division. The unit came under fire immediately upon its arrival in Korea and spent nearly a month securing its base of operations. The first jump came on October 20th, 1950. The mission was to cut railway lines connected to the North Korean capital of Pyongyang. The Peres flew in C-47 Dakotas, as well as the new C-119 flying boxcar. These aircraft were a significant improvement over the Dakota. Most importantly, the men could drop straight out the back of the airplane. Secondly, the heavy lift capability of the aircraft eliminated the need for gliders. Equipment could simply be pushed out the back. The operation went relatively smoothly. Trucks, jeeps, and heavy artillery landed with little damage. Initial fighting was limited. The second and last drop of the 187th came on March 23, 1951. The communist offensive, now subsidized with Chinese troops, had run out of steam, and United Nations forces had succeeded in stabilizing the situation. The reshaping of the world after 1945 left the old order of European empires in a shambles. Nowhere was this more evident after Korea than in France's involvement in her colonies in Indochina. During the fighting with the Viet Minh, France conducted over 150 airborne operations. Undoubtedly, the greatest of these was the attempt to relieve the siege at Dien Bien Phu. By building large fortified garrisons, it was hoped that the Viet Minh would be drawn into fighting conventional set-piece battles. In Operation Castor, in late 1953, 5 parachute battalions were dropped into the Laos-Vietnam border over 4 days to capture the village at Dien Bien Phu. Their orders were to turn it into a fortress to be held with no thought of withdrawal, and at the same time to conduct offensive fighting patrols. During the weeks that followed, French strength climbed to over 10,000 soldiers, including 4 battalions of French Foreign Legionnaires, as well as North African tirailleurs and native Thai infantry. But the Viet Minh, led by the brilliant General Vo Nguyen Giap, had plans of their own. Their accurate and deadly artillery soon had the airstrip under constant and heavy bombardment. Giap was already assembling a force more numerous and far better armed and supplied than the French dreamed possible. By the beginning of March 1954, he had 3 infantry divisions at his disposal, supported by 105mm artillery guns, heavy mortars, and anti-aircraft guns of all calibers. The Vietnamese anti-aircraft fire was so heavy that civilian pilots resupplying the garrison refused to fly over what had become known as the chamber pot. The first blow came on 13 March 1954, when heavy Viet Minh artillery fire deluged the garrison, smashing in shelters and gun trenches. Then followed wave after wave of infantry assaults. By the next morning, one of the 8 outposts had fallen. A parachute battalion jumped in to reinforce the garrison, but this was not enough. During the ensuing next weeks, the Vietnamese grip on the French tightened implacably. The only way to reach and support the shrinking outpost was from the air. 2 further parachute battalions were dropped on April 4th and 7th into an ever-decreasing garrison. The paratroopers almost immediately found themselves in action against a well-equipped enemy, but the efforts of the French airborne forces were largely in vain. By 7 May, it was all over. The French garrison, by now reduced to barely 1,000 men on their feet, eventually capitulated. 11,000 men went into captivity, 30 or 40% of whom were parachutists. It was the end of French rule in Vietnam, and all but the end of the parachutists. 7 battalions were sent into Dien Bien Phu, and none came back. The hot wars of the Cold War continued throughout the 1950s and 60s. British and American paras were in the midst of many of them. The paras would face one of their greatest post-war challenges in Egypt. In 1956, the Egyptian army, led by one Colonel Nasser, overthrew the government. Nasser became president and promptly nationalized the Suez Canal, still a vital link to Britain's Asian interests. He refused to accept the principle of uninterrupted use of the canal by ships of all nations. An ultimatum to the now warring Israelis and Egyptians was rebuffed. Britain decided to intervene, but here resources were limited. The RAF only had transports to lift 668 men. Still, Operation Musketeer, the invasion of Egypt, was ordered on November 5th. The men of 3 para left from Cyprus with 7 jeeps, 6 106mm anti-tank guns, and numerous supply containers. They were bound for the Al Gamal airfield. They faced odds of 5-1 against them. The older men could remember the tense moments just before a drop. The younger soldiers could only steel themselves for combat.
Well, the atmosphere was quite electric, in fact. People were excited. I mean, by and large, we hadn't parachuted on and off jump. There were some of the older soldiers, seniors and such, who giving us the usual stories that we give to the youngsters now that they gave to us then, you know. But there was an air of excitement. And the main thing which struck me, that nobody was overly worried. We were going into Egypt. We'd been stationed there, most of us, for 3 years. We didn't have a high opinion in general of the Egyptian army. I know there were some units which were reasonably good, but in general we didn't think much of them. We didn't honestly think it would be too difficult, and it was excitement, you know, and everybody was keen to go.
A Company soon captured the control tower and support buildings, whilst B Company landed on top of the Egyptian defences on the eastern end of the airfield. Within half an hour, the airfield was in British hands, but it was all for nothing. The Americans and the Russians both viewed the invasion as neo-imperialism and forced an end to the operation. Meanwhile, the British had their hands full in Cyprus. A guerrilla war was being conducted against British control. The guerrillas were considered terrorists by the British Army. British paras played their part in pushing the guerrillas into the hills, where they were unrelentlessly pursued. The operation continued until 1958, when a truce was declared. Cyprus received independence in 1964, but the paras' job was not over. The island's Turk and Greek communities were fighting each other, and the British tried to maintain order. A semblance of stability was achieved, but not peace. Ultimately, a United Nations force was established, and most of the British paras withdrew. During the height of the Cold War, the Russians had as many as 100,000 men in their airborne forces. Training was just as intensive as in the West. The Soviet forces were designed for deep penetration behind NATO lines. In their exercises, they focused on disrupting Western armor, which they faced across the inter-German border. They used both sophisticated technology as well as tried and proven basic weapons, such as petrol bombs. The Spetsnaz forces were the elite of the Soviet airborne forces. Their primary mission was to be flown far into Western Germany on harassment missions. They would expect to be as far as 300 miles inside Allied lines and to be able to fight on their own for an indefinite period of time. In this training exercise in the 1960s, the target was a NATO missile base. Pathfinders would land first at night and sneak up on the Allied facility. Taking out guards, they would attack the missile bunkers, which were the greatest threat to the Russian mainland. If the Cold War had ever heated up, this scene could have been played out from Germany to the British Isles. After the initial surprise skirmish, Soviet doctrine called for a main body of paratroop forces to drop. The Russians were trained to fight the instant they jumped, firing from beneath their parachute canopies. It was a policy using brute force with little regard to taking casualties. World War III would have been a bloody affair. The Soviets had mastered the procedures of not just the surprise attack, but also massive front-line drops. They were early innovators of heavy lift transports and were capable of dropping large amounts of artillery, armor, and men onto NATO positions. Their tactics had not fundamentally changed from their earliest airborne efforts. Deploy large numbers of men to quickly overwhelm any opposition. The role of the American airborne forces changed dramatically in the mid-1960s with their deployment to Vietnam. Fighting a nationalist and communist insurgency, US strategists felt their superior technology could overwhelm the Viet Cong and North Vietnamese. It was in Vietnam that the helicopter was fully developed as an air assault weapon. In late summer 1965, the American 101st Airborne Division and 173rd Airborne Brigade went to war. The aircraft that irrevocably changed the face of warfare in Vietnam was the Bell UH-1 Iroquois, universally known as the Huey on account of its designation. The Huey would become as familiar to airborne forces as the Dakota was in the Second World War. It was perfectly designed for its mission. The terrain and the elusive nature of the enemy had turned the airborne battle over to a new force on the battlefield. In Vietnam, the helicopter emerged as a viable means of conducting military operations. It did everything: casualty evacuation, transport, gunship, airborne command post. But most importantly, it was the US Army's major air assault helicopter, lifting entire battalions into battle or covertly infiltrating small reconnaissance teams. By marrying up airborne forces with helicopters, the concept of mobile or air assault forces was born. Suddenly there were helicopters that could carry tanks, artillery, and most importantly, troops as unified forces. Reserves weren't needed because troops could be shuttled around the battlefield. Fitted with door-mounted guns, the helicopter could also provide its own fire support during an air assault, covering landings and withdrawals and suppressing resistance. In spite of all the fighting the airborne forces did, they conducted only one conventional mass parachute drop in February 1967 in Operation Junction City. Nearly 800 men would drop in a search and destroy mission. Ironically, the men who were assigned to the airborne forces did most of their fighting on the ground as infantry.
I was very heavily involved in a major battle 22 days after I arrived in country. And just as in World War II, the swarming and hornet and bee effect of individuals in small units accomplishing things when plans go awry was tremendous. But the battle that we were in was in heavy jungle. We did not have the artillery and air support because of weather conditions, and these soldiers did fantastic things. This particular battle was in Doc To, and on paper my platoon strength was 47. In the field, in fact, it was 21, of which one was a dog handler that spoke no English. He was Vietnamese. And we had 2 people carrying heavy radios. And our change of mission was to take this group and to relieve a reconnaissance force who was down to 40% strength. And we changed missions. We went cross-country, across streams, and cut our way through bamboo jungles and got there, and suffered severely. We took 1/3 casualties, but in conjunction with 2 other units moving the same way, we're able to relieve that force and took the pressure off. And we found out later it was a regimental encampment that we had been involved with. So I think the total number of people involved relative to the enemy force speaks for itself.
While the Americans were fighting an unconventional war in Vietnam with very limited success, the British were doing battle in the Middle East. A tribal rebellion had broken out in the remote Radfan region of Aden. Here, in the rugged and hostile terrain, tribesmen, backed by Egypt and Yemen, threatened the peace of the Saudi peninsula. The focus of much of their activity was harassment of travelers on the Dala Road, a main route to Mecca. As the turmoil increased, British forces in the region reorganized and para-units were sent in to restore order.
The remainder of the battalion was then brought down. B Company had to go back to reserve a presence in the Gulf. And I was ordered to get onto the heights above the Wadi Dibsan to show the tribesmen that we could go wherever we wanted. And we did that by a night march, which outsmarted them because they were not used to fighting by night, and then by sweeping them off by day. It was then decided that further than that, we would go down into the Wadi Dibsan to destroy their food stocks, to teach them a lesson. Well, once again, we came down into the Wadi by night, going down some pretty steep slopes. But having got down there, we continued in daylight. I had a company of Royal Marines with me, and a minor error occurred amongst one of their reporters, who announced he was 10,000 yards ahead of his actual position. Scarcely able to believe this, I left the brigadier. He and I were together when this news came in. I went off in my helicopter, piloted by Major Jake Jackson, the Army Air Corps. And we'd only gone about 5,000 yards forward when I saw Red Farnies with their rifles on either side of the cliffs, who were shooting at us, and it was quite plain that we had to turn back. We were then hit. The pilot very skillfully managed to bring the pilot just back inside the range of my own weapons. And thankfully, from my point of view, the Remy corporals who came up that night to work on it got it fit for flight, and he got out the next day. Nonetheless, apart from those adventures, the battalion advanced to all its objectives, and the Red Farnies realized that they were not going to be able to hide in the hills indefinitely and stay out of the way.
In numerous actions in the weeks that followed, the Paras were to demonstrate the unique fighting qualities that had served them so well since the early 1940s, primarily an ability to operate far from base with limited outside support. Long days of patrolling through the hills maintained a presence that the tribesmen could not ignore. It was tough going in the desperate heat of the desert. They would have to survive with the limited food and water that they could carry. They would have to prove to the rebels that they could not just match them in the desert, but be even tougher. A pace was established by the Paras and other army units, but ultimately British policy in the region changed and British forces were withdrawn. In 1969, the Paras were brought home to a very different kind of war: Northern Ireland. The 16th Parachute Brigade was deployed to that troubled province. The fighting in the streets of Derry and Belfast were as dangerous to the Paras as any conventional conflict.
You would go out time and time and time again on the same patrol. You had to vary your pattern, so you didn't form a sort of set pattern for them to go at. You lived in crowded conditions. We took over initially old factories, which were old and ruined, and breweries and shirt-making factories, and the police stations, which were made to hold, say, 100 policemen, were made to hold something like 300 troops, and we squeezed into every little hole and nook and cranny. The weather was foul, the rain came in, the wind came in, they put up corrugated iron in the windows, they brought in heaters, they brought in furniture, all the old ladies had a spare chair sent it in, and the first 2 or 3 years, the conditions were bad, they really were bad. The high level of violence in those days, far higher, obviously initially than it turned out subsequently, meant the soldiers had a hard time, a very hard time.
For the regiment, it was the start of many and often unpleasant tours of duty.
We came back the next year. We were back round about summertime, and everything had completely changed. We were in a small park on a Protestant estate, and the Protestants were slightly anti, and the Catholic side, the Republican side, had flared up in as much that we had shooting incidents and bombing incidents almost every day of the week. They blew up part of our camp.
This was the new phase of war. There were no front lines other than the streets. The IRA could attack and melt back into civilian life by simply turning a corner and ducking into a house. Protestant extremists could be just as dangerous to the troops. Many in the community saw them as an occupation force. At best, the Peres had the thankless job of just trying to keep the warring Protestants and Catholics apart. They would face danger and hardship every day of their assignment, and sometimes be given little credit for the successes they did have. As in any civil war, there was more than enough pain for all those involved. It made great demands on the individual soldiers.
I think the older members of the battalion, not just myself, but the older member, I mean in sergeant corporal level, who have been to Northern Ireland, who will then ensure that that section or that brick or whatever they call themselves these days is going to be trained to the best possible readiness, if you like. Because let's face it, you're on the commander there could be a corporal. He's the guy who makes the decision on the ground, and if his boys under his command do not react to the drills that they've practiced, then they've got problems. And I think we motivate ourselves by saying, let's go out there and come back with the same amount of people we took out there. I mean, you've got to have that positive attitude out there, because if you slow down or take things as mandatory day-to-day things, you will get hit. There's no two ways about it. You've always got to be on your toes out there. You've always got to be alert. You've got to think, I could do this, I could ambush somebody here, I could put a device here. You've got to be thinking like that, and that's the way you'll survive out there.
On any given day, the battlefield might be a housing estate, the enemy unknown.
Northern Ireland becomes very difficult, and it can become very sort of contentious and controversial and so on. But I think at the end of the day, we are soldiers which are deployed to go to Northern Ireland to do a job, which is just maintain the peace unbiasedly. And the soldiers will go from being having verbal abuse or abuse from the local civilians to being basically constantly aimed to be blown up or killed by the terrorists out there. I think the main thing is constantly keeping the soldiers sort of motivated and maintaining their own self-discipline. And it's very difficult, it can be very difficult at times, because you are constantly balanced with do we really need to do this? When in actual fact we do, that's why we're there, against the risk factor of perhaps patrolling. And we, again, as a parachute regiment, do believe in doing a job properly. As Montgomery quotation says, we are basically professional in everything we do, and eternal optimists, and therefore we go there to try and achieve that job we're asked to do.
During the 1970s, economic pressures forced reductions in Britain's airborne forces. The Peres may have been reduced in numbers, but they would maintain their spirit. It would be needed soon enough. The 1970s were an active time for airborne across a number of fronts. The French had to intervene in their former African colonies several times to protect against unrest. In 1978, they were needed in Kolwezi, Zaire, when the Katanga rebellion threatened the lives of European residents. French Foreign Legion and Belgian Peres conducted what they called a knockout punch, a very swift operation lasting less than a month. It was very efficient and very brutal. This mission was a humanitarian one. The Legion was able to save some 2,000 lives before some 150 Europeans had been slaughtered. The result was Zaire achieved a degree of stability. Southern Africa has also been the scene of one of the continent's longest-running conflicts. South African paras first helped the Rhodesians during their long civil war in the 1970s. Once white rule ended, the focus of attention shifted to Angola, which bordered the South Africa-controlled Namibia. In 1987 and 1988, Angolan and Cuban troops fought pitched battles with South African forces. The South African Airborne Forces, or Parabats, were a crucial part of the battles. They provided reconnaissance teams, or recce's, that excelled at tracking enemy troops in the vast wastelands of the bush. The recce's provided the intelligence necessary to mount large-scale airborne operations. The men felt they were fighting against attempted communist domination of the continent. Their enthusiasm was sincere and great. The war in Angola soon ended with the Cubans leaving. The early 1980s saw British airborne forces in perhaps their greatest post-war challenge. In 1982, Argentina invaded the Falkland Islands. Britain sent the Royal Marines and the paras along with other units to take them back. The first major land battle with the Argentines was for Goose Green and Darwin. Two para had to move down a narrow isthmus in the dark, fighting all the way with little ground cover. By daylight, the weather was too bad for supporting air cover, and the attack was in danger of bogging down in the face of fierce Argentine defense. It was at this moment that Colonel H. Jones, the battalion's commanding officer, led an attack through a gully to dislodge the enemy from their positions. Caught in enemy crossfire, Colonel H. was mortally wounded within feet of their trenches. His courage had been exemplary and inspired his soldiers with renewed determination, although they were outnumbered 3-1. Goose Green fell, and for his courage and sacrifice, Colonel H. Jones was awarded with a posthumous Victoria Cross. Three para, meanwhile, were headed for Port Stanley. As they advanced, the paras ran into the strong Argentine defenses around Port Stanley, which hinged on positions around Mount Longdon.
As it was, our forward left platoon took the brunt of it because they were a sort of alert on that side of the position, and forward platoon took quite a few casualties there and then. We then all scuttled forward in platoon, I was in company HQ, to the lower base, rocket area, if you like, of Mount Longdon, to be held up by snipers and the waking up of the rest of the Argies, if you like. For the whole battle, I mean, it was relentless. It was bayonet fighting. You had to literally to take ground. You had to fight from trench to trench, and this you don't realise, but it's very time-consuming. We didn't realise the sort of hours we were on the battle, but it was a considerable amount of hours to take this position. And all I can say is that the training and the instinctive drills that we practiced continually in peacetime put us in good stead when we were there. I had a very young company, average age of about 22, and I can put my hand on my heart and say that there was never any time that any of my young lads let me down. If they lost a leader, they simply took over and became a leader. And I mean that from Lance Corporal level, you know, twice the other section commander or whatever, platoon sergeant, whatever we lost or were injured, somebody would take, without being told, would take that job responsibility on, and that was the beauty. They kept the momentum going all the way through the battle.
Sergeant Ian Mackay was awarded a posthumous Victoria Cross for his single-handed assault against a machine gun position. His and Colonel H's bravery were typical of airborne forces. The victory in the Falklands joins the list of para-battle honours that date from the Second World War. The conflicts at the end of the century would require just as much tenacity and dedication to duty. The airborne forces would be ready.